right, welcome everybody to our April Fireside Chat. I'm Kirk Hanson, Director of Forestry for the Northwest Natural Resource Group. Thanks for joining us. I got a great topic tonight and great guest speaker. Ken Bevis is with us, the wildlife biologist for our State Department of Natural Resources. I've worked with Ken for years, and he's a great resource for small woodland owners. So he's going to chat with us for about a half hour tonight, share with us some of his wisdom and anecdotes about enhancing and conserving wildlife habitat. Before we get into that, for those of you that are new to the Fireside Chats, this is a monthly event that we host on different topics related to small woodlands management. And we're in our second year of doing this. By the fact that you've signed up for this, you'll be getting the announcements for future Fireside Chats. And as is typical with any kind of a Zoom meeting like this, if you have any questions as we go throughout the presentation, you can either put them in the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of Ken's presentation, Alex will go through those, filter them out, and pose some of those questions to Ken. And then once we finish with that, we'll open it up for general discussion, and we'll just get kind of a dialogue going back and forth amongst everybody. And hoping that people will share some anecdotes and experiences from their own woodlands, because we'd love to hear from you, both, the wildlife that you're seeing out there, and in particular, the activities, the things that you're doing to conserve and enhance wildlife habitat. If you're not familiar with our organization, the Northwest Natural Resource Group that's hosting this event, we are a small woodland owner organization, membership-based organization. We've got a couple hundred members throughout Oregon and Washington. And we help folks optimize both the economic and the ecological potential of their forest lands. So we can help you with forest management planning, forest restoration, ecologically based timber harvesting, kind of anything that you need as a small woodland owner to manage your forest. We're a nonprofit organization, so we also get grants to do education, training, research, and part of the educational program is bringing events like this, the Fireside Chat, to you. So with that, as an introduction to the evening, what I'd like to do now is introduce our guest, Ken Bevis, a superstar in the small woodland owner community. I would imagine a fair number of you have had Ken out to your forests to consult on wildlife habitat. And so what Ken's going to do, he has a presentation that he's going to go through over the next 20-25 minutes or so, and then again we'll open it up for a conversation, and y'all can pepper him with all of the questions that you've ever wanted to get answers to, and we'll see what happens after that. So Ken, really appreciate you joining this evening, and I will turn the talking stick over to you and take it from here. Edify and amaze us.
Okay, Kirk, for the good of the order too, somebody's microphone is on. So do the mute thing across the audience here, because sometimes we'll get the cars on the street and stuff. Thank you. Hey, Kirk, thank you for that kind introduction. I actually, for the good of the order, didn't really plan on, quote, a presentation. Kirk gave me this marvelous little outline of high points to hit. And so I scratched around in some of my previous presentations and came up with them, but I think it'll work. So I think we'll walk through this set of points, and then we can circle back to examples in the discussion, because I'm really interested in getting feedback from people as to what works. So I'll share an anecdote with an email that I got today, that this lovely family up near Granite Falls has taken coach planning, has been to the field days, has heard the recommendations. And he writes, he says, I'd really like you to come out, because over the past 5 years, when we did this stuff, we're not noticing more birds. What's wrong? And I think that's a really interesting question. It's like, well, and you think through, all the ramifications of that. How is your data set being gathered? What are you comparing it to? Which birds? How are you looking? Is this just your impression? So I thought that was really interesting because it's sort of a negative outcome to the assumption of if you build it, they will come. So many of you have heard me say this, that basically wildlife is an emergent property of habitat. And so you get what you get with the habitat that you get. Another anecdote, interesting lady, really liked bats. And so had visited her property and everything. And she sent me an email and said, I really like the idea of bats. Where can I get some? How about that, Kirk? Is there a mail order bat place? Did she imagine we should go and get a bag of bats and then turn them loose? So anyway, it's just pretty interesting. And the folks that we work with, are wonderful. The forest landowners are some of the most wonderful people in the world. And what I really, really like about this work is that we can directly influence action on the environment to support all the benefits that come out of forests, including wildlife. And so it's pretty interesting that whenever we do those values surveys, I bet most people in this room have done that. Kirk, do you do that with your clients where they run through the 1 through 5? This is important. That's important.
Yep, you bet.
Yeah, the top 4 values are always something. They're always something
that's
like.
Why I asked if you knew where it was.
They're
You
always.
said you didn't need.
There you go. They're always something like protect the environment. Privacy is always up there. Let's see, maintain habitat wildlife. Wildlife is usually number 3 or 4 in regard to objectives, which are part of that aesthetic cluster. And so my role is to help give people things to address that. And that's what we're going to walk through. So let me share this little set of pictures here. I don't even really want to call it a presentation, but I guess it is. And so we'll go here. Can you see that, Kirk?
Yep, you bet. Got it.
All right, from the beginning, here we go. Boom. So just a few tidbits about wildlife on small woodlands. And, we can't, by the way, we can't quite come up with a really tidy title for small forest landowners. I always think that's funny because small forest landowners implies you guys are really short, and it's not that. So we came up with woodland so that's a whole nother topic, but here we go. A few tidbits. So in Western Washington, and I'm assuming most of your clients are Western Washington, Kirk, correct? There's lots of forest that are naturally regenerated in the 70 to 120-year-old age class. Fair, Kirk, nod if I'm getting things about right. And there's a lot. This is Miller Sylvania Park, but it is a park, but that was logged off in like 1890. And there it is today, all grown back, multi-layered, lots of habitat complexity. And the original forest, the old growth that covered, most of Western Washington with variability, admittedly, but this picture is from the Quinault, and admittedly, this is like a way, 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 way rich rainforest, but look at the canopy structure. Look at these gaps. Look at the layering in this thing. This is crazy. Like there's mid layers, there's these really, really tall overstory trees. These gaps probably came out of wind throw, root rot, maybe a small fire, whatever, but these natural forests from which emerged our fauna. This is where our fauna came from. And it's a really, really significant point that most of the wildlife that we have on our forest is the stuff that's been here, since time immemorial. And these old forests had that particular wrinkle that some of the trees were really big and really old. And on this particular stand, there's 8-foot in diameter Douglas firs that are 600 years old. It's like, wow. So the potential of the forest for really, really old multi-layered habitat. So that's a significant point in regard to where we're going with this, because we don't have a lot of that on the landscape. Most people have something closer to that or some of this. And so plantation forestry really didn't get going on the landscape until, now Kirk, you can fix me on this too if I get it wrong, but roughly after World War II, when we started to get the nurseries really cranked up and we started to use even age harvest replanting. And so a lot of the even age forest like there's Julie Sackett in a 17-year-old planted Douglas fir stand. That's amazing. Look at these gaps between those whorls. Holy smokes, this is a really good way to grow wood fiber. And it does work. And we've got lots of this on the landscape, some of it getting into the third or even fourth rotation of being harvested, usually probably the third. That fair, Kirk? If we had some of, yeah. So anyway, you may have some of that on your property. And I bet a lot of times our small landowners will have pieces of plantations or pieces of plantations that did or did not work, where you have this kind of mix and match. But usually they were intended to be grown as even age crops. And so the plantation forestry was being established for a single objective, which was to grow trees as quickly as possible, to harvest, to grow trees, to harvest. And when those plantations land on a small forest landowner's property who has these different objectives, all of a sudden you might have a forest like this. And I've run into this a few times where the landowner is going, well, how can I improve this for wildlife? What can I do to, let's see, I don't know if this is the right word, but to kind of naturalize this, to almost change the objectives of the land use. And that's what I'm going to address. And, and by the way, there's no judgment there about even age forestry. It works. It's a very successful technique for growing wood fiber, but it's often very different from our small landowners. So there you go. So remember that natural structure. This is a natural forest on Whidbey Island, and these trees are only about 80 or 90 years old, but look at the structure of that. I think that's really interesting, that it looks a lot like that old forest. So to the fundamental point, that forests are these really complex habitats, and they're not, just single rows of trees at all. And so this is my own kind of, I'm a lumper. And I confess to being lazy, because lumpers are criticized by hardcore science people for lack of precision. However, if you have enough backstory within your lump, then there can be some overall truths that come out of that. And so in my looking at the forest, I break it into these four parts: the canopy itself, meaning the trees over your head, the leafy canopies, the stems themselves, the understory, that shrub layer. I'm not going to say much about this, but holy smokes, the understory, the brush, is one of the richest habitats we have in this part of the world. And Kirk, maybe you've done this with some of your clients, but go out there, and get a sense of the shrub species, and you'll go in some spot and you're going to see, two kinds of huckleberry, salal, salmonberry, sword fern, Oregon grape, on and on. And you're going to come up with somewhere between 2 and 3 times the number of dominant species in that understory as you will overstory. You look at the overstory, there'll be Douglas fir, cedar, hemlock, alder, big leaf maple. And it's pretty interesting. And so that native understory is a really, really rich habitat where an awful lot of our wildlife lives. Think about a lot of the songbirds and things, they're down there. And then down on the ground itself, literally the fossorial environment under the soil and the dead wood on top of that, adding to that. So those are the 4 general habitat elements that we influence in our management. And so I really like to think of that, because each one has a different set of species associated with it. So in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, there's about 400 vertebrate species. And, I love that argument. It's like, so we'll see, maybe hit me in the chat with this later, but how many people think slugs are wildlife? I'd say, yeah, exactly. They are. How do you tell a boy slug from a girl slug? Do you know that one, Kirk? You don't. They're both. It's not a joke. Slugs are boys and girls. They don't have to work to get a date. So 400 species of vertebrate wildlife, ranging all the way from, hummingbirds or shrews, like little teeny shrews, up to an elk, or actually a moose is the heaviest. But, this is quite the range, with amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals being those 4 major groups. And I sort of skirted around the invertebrates, the slugs and the snails and the insects, because they're also a huge part of the fauna, that are influenced by our management. But it's a pretty darn interesting and diverse set. And so one of your tasks as a small landowner is to become an expert of what occurs on your property. And oh God, I get so many wonderful stories of somebody says like, well, we saw this, weasel. I think it was an ermine and da da da. It's like, it probably was. Trail cameras for getting information, all that. So 400 species. Now, a lot of times the discussion will start with deer and in certain areas elk because they're big and they're amazing and everything. And that photo is not photoshopped. No, Kirk thought I'd fake that one. This was from over near Yakima, and Ellie the elk apparently was an orphan and hand raised and lived out in the Autanum. And when the landowner was like, yeah, I used to give her apples. I know I shouldn't have. And so she photobombed a family reunion there. So anyway, so deer and elk being, they essentially have to bed down somewhere where the weather is a little bit less severe, let's say when it's raining or something. So they go under trees, but they eat grass and shrubs. Deer in particular are browsers. And so if you looked at succession, and I know everybody in this event here knows about succession, holy smokes, the best deer and elk habitat is way up here in early succession. I mean, I've said this before, you could cut down all the trees, grow grass and shrubs, and the deer and the elk would probably like it. It'd be fine. They don't really need that much cover to hide in. So they're not necessarily forest dependent species. So that's just a digression there and a little bit of a side note. However, there are forest dependent species like my favorite bird, the pileated woodpecker. And I bet you everybody in the room knows what these are. The biggest woodpecker in North America, amazing chisel on their head. Woody woodpecker was modeled after the pileated woodpecker. Make these big oval holes in trees. Go after wood borers and carpenter ants. So they're not, when you see holes in trees from woodpeckers, the woodpeckers are going after the insects that are breaking down the wood. Generally, they're not, quote, the bad bugs. They're part of the recycling process for all this dead wood. So pileated woodpecker being a really good example of a species that is dependent on the forest and that has to have certain habitat elements to survive. And Kirk, what's coming right here. I keep picking on Kirk because I can see him. You know what's coming here, and that is dead wood. Yay for dead wood. I like to, maybe for those who've heard my coach planning, I'll do this and I'll say dead wood's important habitat, and then I'll show a picture of a snag, and I'm about to do it. And oh wait, I'll do it. I'll save that joke. So we've learned in the past 50 years. I'm looking at Kirk again. Is that about the Jerry Franklin phase, like 1970s, 80s? Because they did this old growth research in H.J. Andrews. And if you listen to the WSU Forest Overstory podcast, which is still online with Jerry Franklin, listen to that Jerry Franklin one, because he is the grand old man of forestry. And he goes on and he waxes eloquent about being a young man going to school to study the forest, and they needed a topic, and they realized people had not done very much work on the old forest. There was always the assumption that the old forest was kind of rotting away and it was a wasteland and it was, a desert, quote, a desert for wildlife, which was driven by perceptions of deer and elk, I might add. But they found out that indeed the forest floor and the development of forest soils and all this and all of these habitat were very much influenced by the presence of the trees after they died. And, trees last for a long time, but they last as long after they die as they did when they're alive. And I just kind of like this sort of, I know this, see, I'm lumping again here, and I'm riffing on my lump, but approximately a tree will last the same amount of time after it dies as it did alive. So imagine 100-year-old tree, something kills it, bark beetles, whatever, drought. And for 5, 10 years, the branches are still on it. Year 25, the top breaks out. Year 35, 45, 55, 65, it looks like that. For 50 years, then it falls over and it lays there as a log. and it takes another 50 years before it's unrecognizable. So might even be longer. The dead wood lasts a long time. Wood is a remarkable substance, and woodpeckers as a group use that dead wood as a critical habitat feature to make their cool nest cavities. So when you see that little round hole from the woodpecker hole, they're making this amazing, what's the word? What's that shape? Like a gourd shape hollow in that dead stem for their nesting. And they do that every year. They make a new one every year, which is another sort of crazy tidbit about woodpecker. Woodpecker is a descriptive term for different birds that have this life habit. So it's not a genus or anything, but they make that thing every year. So these can be really key habitat features. So on your forest, if you have trees that exhibit cavity excavation, that means that the center of that tree has softened in just the right trajectory where the outer parts are holding together, and they're able to do that. And it's pretty cool. And it's not every snag. I learned this from actually reading scientific literature, that they did some work and they found out that a snag is not a snag is not a snag in regard to cavity excavation. But just that, it's a really important habitat feature. Falls over, lays there on the ground. That down log is an amazing habitat feature. This example right here, looking at Kirk again. Have you ever been out to the Forks, University of Washington research place? Okay, that log is right off of the ball field where we had a field day a few years ago. And that ball field was a log landing back in the day, and they had pushed some of the butt logs and stuff off of the field. And so that log was cut probably 1890, the year 1900, something like that. And there it is. This was like 5 years ago. That sucker is still intact. Pretty amazing. So great habitat features. And they also provide different substrate for vegetation. This little example, all this moss on the down wood, and then the soil itself has coltsfoot instead of the mosses. Breaks into the soil. I already said this, starting to molder in, and a big piece of dead wood acts like slow motion compost. Smaller the pieces of wood, the faster they break down. And so just that, so it becomes soil. So this is pretty interesting. And how many people go look for chanterelles, right? Aren't they usually associated with some kind of duff in just the right spot? Yeah, so there we go. These downwood habitats, lots of the little stuff lives down there. The amphibian fauna in the Northwest, where do they go? In the uplands? And a lot of times it's associated with downwood and small mammals, the little stuff that drives the system. A lot of it lives in association with logs. Kirk, do you want to pause there and do questions, or should I keep grinding on with these enhancement two things?
No, go ahead. I think we've got another, 4 or 5 minutes at least here if you want to.
Okay.
Yeah, if you've got more. This is great, Ken. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm doing a real high level overview here. So you have your small forest land, and if we are going to manage it for habitat complexity, and you may be paying attention to some good snags or some good down logs or some big trees and clumps, or, however you do your arrangement and you're conscious of that, there are other things you can do that are in addition. And here's one that I've been promoting for quite a while, but I like to call them habitat piles. Now, we are in a situation where a lot of our stands are in a mid-successional status where there's a lot of stems. There's, that we're basically overstocked, anticipating drought and hotter times. Everybody's been thinking about this, sometimes wringing their hands. I need to do some thinning. Or in the east side in particular, I'm freaked out about fire. I need to reduce my fuels. By the way, Kirk, what's the difference between habitat and fuel? Exactly. Sometimes fuel is really good habitat. And so it's like, but if it's around your house, habitat my foot, that's fuel.
Yeah, it looks like a bonfire to me. I've had parties with habitat piles like that. Habitat piles.
Exactly. Well, no, okay, good. Thank you. So there's three kinds of piles. There's a slash pile, That's unconsolidated logging material from harvest usually. There's a brush pile, which is usually smaller diameter stuff stacked, kind of at random, that's often to be disposed of. It'll be burned, chipped, something like that. It's considered, what's the word? Excess or hazard, or people don't like looking at it, whatever. That's a brush pile. Then there's a habitat pile. And there's a reason for the terminology, because I am starting to become convinced that language really matters, because language will address your intent. So a habitat pile is something that you construct in a place where you intend to leave it for the benefit of all these creatures that go into these piles. I don't know if anybody knows Trisha Otto up by Lake Whatcom. I don't know if you've ever worked with her, Kirk. This lady is like wildlife centric, crazy, loves all the stuff. And she said one time, the fastest thing you can do to benefit wildlife is build a pile. And it's true. How many times have you seen a song sparrow or a chipmunk or a junco or, something on your pile? And I've had a couple projects now where people have put trail cameras on piles, and sure enough, they get used a lot, which totally makes sense. Food, water, cover. Okay, so they do work. If they're in the way, you don't like them, then like Kirk, I burned them too. And you can smell the squirrels sizzling when that happens. That's a bad wildlife joke, isn't it? No, but okay, but a habitat pile, here's the trick too, and that is you put the big stuff on the bottom. So you put the big stuff on the bottom in a series of however you do it. And we'll do that in a second here. And then you put the finer stuff on top. And then as the finer stuff breaks down, it stays hollow. So you maintain the interstitial spaces for habitat for, think of all the things that could go in there. And they're mostly little things, but long-tailed weasel, already said chipmunk, snowshoe hare, cottontail rabbit, quail, if you're in a kind of an urban setting. So the big stuff goes on the bottom, then put some other stuff on it. And there you go. There's a nice habitat pile built to spec, if you want to call it that, and over near Suncadia. And you can also get really creative and make den structures with the bigger material. So this is a what's the word? A tutorial example. But if you were a raccoon or a bobcat and you had a chance to go in there when it's raining, wouldn't you do that? Heck yeah. Heck yeah. So you can build den sites. There's a name for these too, is bioden, which will be, where you get kind of creative. And I've found out from talking to different landowners who've gotten the habitat pile bug, myself included, that inevitably the pile itself, if it's done to the basic spec of the big stuff on the bottom so that it doesn't collapse, then how it comes out is driven by the creativity of the person and the stuff that's within reach, like, where it is. So the only caveat is no green pine between February and October. But on the west side, even green stuff, we don't have big blips of insects. So they're not essentially a source of bad bugs, which is a significant reality because it's decaying wood. And so there you go. So that's a habitat pile. So the last one would be nest boxes. And nest boxes are an interesting thing because they have to be maintained. If you embark on a nest box project, and I'll use Kit Ellis as a great example. Kit, sorry, I'm going to pick on you here. She had some wood duck boxes around her lake that were maintained for years, and a bear found them and smashed them. They fixed a few of them, and then her Kit, you can correct me if I got this wrong, but your volunteers that were helping to maintain them moved on. And so it's a great example of a successful project for a while. She got lots of wood ducks out of them, and then the maintenance has fallen off. So we got to kind of rejuvenate that. So nest boxes do work, and they need to be maintained at least once a year. There's basically two different kinds. They're better if you can put them up a little higher. Out in the open is fine. You don't want to attach them to trees with steel nails, because sooner or later Kirk's going to be out there cutting firewood and he's going to hit that 16 penny nail. Don't do that. Use those gutter nails, those big aluminum nails, and the saw will go right through them. So anyway, but nest boxes essentially imitate those abandoned woodpecker holes, and they do work. I've had several clients over the last few years who've embarked upon, box projects with dozens and dozens that they clean out. And one man, Lynn Miner up in Northeast Washington, he had 500 nest boxes up. Check that out, Kirk. Baudorf went there and said, you should try boxes. And Len went, okay. He made 500 boxes. And then he monitored them for years. And I said, what'd you get in your boxes? He goes, everything. And he started naming stuff, weasels and chickadees. He said, I even had a martin one time, little owls, squirrels, lots of squirrels, Douglas squirrels and flying squirrels will use your boxes. So there's a lot to it. I really like them because they do work. These two particular techniques, they work, they're active management, and makes you feel good. So there you go. So the habitat diversity with a little bit of enhancement is the key to providing those niches, all those different sub niches for this amazing variety of species that we have. And we can't really, now here's the reality check on habitat management. You're not managing a population, you're managing opportunities for wildlife to exploit when they occur, and hopefully they show up. Sometimes people will expect certain animals that may or may not live in your neighborhood, or you have something that someone else doesn't. That's okay. But habitat diversity is the key. The last thing is, this is my program. Some of you have worked with the DNR Service Forestry group. There's my email right there. If you want to send me pictures of something, I'll put this back up. And we have this cool landowner assistance portal now. And maybe Holly could put something in the chat about this, but it's pretty cool because we have service foresters all around the state that can help you. And we help work with Kirk and NNRG. And so there we are. So that's my non-presentation presentation that was not complete, but hopefully that'll be fodder for some discussion. How long was that, Kirk?
Yeah, no, that's great, Ken. That's great. You're the master of non-presentation presentations. I consider that a lesson for me. That's great.
My riffs are my riffs. Okay.
Well, while Alex is looking through some of the questions in the chat there, I just want to pose a couple myself. So, one question that I get posed with a lot, and I don't even know if I fully have an answer to it myself, but how would you advise a forest owner to evaluate, the current habitat potential of their land, and identify what the limiting factors are, so they're not swamped or overwhelmed with, gosh, I've got to improve habitat for everything. After making this evaluation, I've got a better sense of what's already working in my forest, but I know what some of the missing elements are, limiting factors are. How would you advise somebody to approach evaluating their forest like that?
I would do it as a subset of your forest inventory, because you're already doing stand typing, right? You're already doing stands are lumping. I shouldn't criticize lumping too much, because when you draw a stand here that says it's a 25-year-old Douglas fir stand, then within that, you could do a sub analysis of those critical factors, because once you have your stands too, you're looking at patchiness. So I've made the comment before that there's two layers to habitat, and one is kind of the broad, like how much forest do you have, how much meadow do you have, how much old forest do you have, older forest, how much brush or shrubs, and then within the stand, how many snags are there, snags, down logs, shrub complexity, how rich is your understory. And you can be really subjective about it, but we all know there's big differences in places where the evergreen huckleberries are like, whoa, look at that. So those two things, look within the stand for critical elements, and look at the arrangement of the stands themselves so you could typify them. And look for really, really valuable features like ephemeral wetlands and big snags, big cavity snags, which are not very common. So to that snag point, a snag is not a snag is not a snag. A big, like pileated cavity snag, that's a rare feature. And so that should be noted unto itself. Did that make sense?
Yeah, great. All right, I can see a bunch more questions coming in, so I think we'll do is turn it over to Alex to vet some of those questions and pose them to Ken.
Yeah, well, we had a bunch of questions come in through registrations, and I'm going to go through those chronologically. So whoever asked first gets to go first. Michael Bonoff asked about cavity nesters' tree utilization needs. So like maybe, Ken, you could talk specifically about that. You mentioned a snag is not a snag is not a snag. And I wonder, Michael, you're on the call. You can feel free to elaborate your question here. But
wait, you mean like what would be some suggestions for particular trees to maintain or do something to encourage excavation? Is that you were like asking about trees being selected specifically for cavities? Is that what you're after, Michael? Because some
he's nodding, yeah.
Okay, some species are better than others. Like, well, lodgepole doesn't matter on the west side, but Doug fir, cedar would probably be the two best. A really good cavity tree or cottonwoods, once they get dead parts, they grow really fast. Alders, like small, like fast growing alders, not so good, but once they get to be 60, 70, 80 years old, they break off. So look for trees with some kind of internal defect. And there's that language again, defect. Places with some kind of a scarring, some kind of rot inside. If you really want to be active and you feel like your stand is, what's the word? Deficient. I mean, you can top trees. There's arborist types out there who will make habitat trees by way of basically sawing the top out of the tree, jag it up, and then the rot trajectory. And I didn't put hazard to habitat in here, but the tree will soften from the top, and it takes time. There is one thing that it takes sometimes 10 years for a newly broken off tree to soften up. So I guess I'm rambling here, but one thing to watch for would be broken top trees, because they often will be the ones that soften appropriately to get the cavity. Oh, that slide that I had, there was that one with the two trees that had all the holes in them. Those were both broken off trees. Yeah. So look for those features. If they're not in your stand, and I'll use an example. We had a fellow out by Shelton who was actively restoring complexity, and he did thinning in his stand by topping trees. So he went in and topped like 12-inch trees and he was going to thin them anyway. So it was like, okay, I'll have a 30-foot stump, which was kind of cool. And it's starting to work. It's taken a couple years. Did that make sense?
Yep, I think Michael's nodding. Thumbs
okay,
up.
Good. I can't see him. So okay. Okay.
Dave Galvin asked, do you have any specific suggestions for managing for pine martens and snowshoe hares? They have 80 plus acres to manage at 3,000 feet at Snoqualmie Pass and a mixture of hemlock and silver fir.
Let's see. So both of those species are tied to dense understory things. Like snowshoe hares really like piles, and you think about where snowshoe hares live, they're in those dense lodgepole-y things, and then they'll go out in the open. So a mix of openings and dense stuff. Marten are deep forest creatures. They eat small mammals, they run up logs, they go up trees. So they're not a creature of the open. The pine marten would be something that would occur scantily on the landscape. I mean, something that's happened with marten in the past few years is there's not very many people trapping anymore. Fur markets, all that stuff. I mean, I bet you there's people in the room who knew someone somewhere in their life who was a hobby trapper, and they'd go out, and there's not very many. And a few years back in the state of Washington, and I'm saying this because marten populations are probably slowly creeping upward, but they're never very numerous. You know, they're never really, really abundant on the landscape. So you could assist both of those species through habitat complexity and snowshoe hare in particular with some really dense pockets. Think about where you see their tracks in the snow, because snowshoe hare don't migrate. They move around on the landscape a little bit, but they'll stay right where they are if they've got good habitat. So yeah, look for complexity with dense stuff. How was that? Snoqualmie Pass is a cool area.
Thanks, Ken. Thumbs up from Dave.
All right.
Janet asked, what's the best way to manage a meadow for wildlife? And Janet, I don't know if you have any specific wildlife in mind. I think you're on the call.
Where's your meadow, and what kind of noxious weeds are you dealing with? I mean, is it an old pasture? Is it a mountain wetland meadow? Is your long-term goal to keep it in meadow? What's the vegetation community in the meadow like? Do you graze any domestics there? So there's a few caveats here, because okay, if you have noxious, get those out of there. If you want to keep it as a meadow and you're getting tree encroachment, you may actually mow it once a year. That's something, I don't know, maybe Kirk, you throw that out there sometime, is like, you don't want trees out there. So, you know, I don't, that's my opinion. If you have a wildland meadow, you really don't need to fertilize it or till it or stuff like that if your vegetation is what you want. And if it's what you want, then you got to figure out how to maintain it and not let it fill in with trees. It's a case where you might like literally go out there with a pair of loppers, and as trees encroach, you cut them.
Janet says in the chat, she's in San Juan's, no domestic grazers, has been controlling noxious weeds for 10 years.
Nice.
Hopefully it's been successful, and lots of wild rose.
Lots of wild rose. Okay, so the wild rose is going to take it into a shrub condition. And if you don't like that, oh, and okay, if you're on the San Juans too, you're going to deal with blackberries that are going to be trying to come in. So that's one thing too, is if you want to maintain the opening as like grass and forbs, you're going to actually have to push back on the woody stuff too. Otherwise, it's going to wind up as a rose thicket or a blackberry thicket. And we've all seen those places where the blackberries won, which ironically is a pretty good habitat for a lot of things. It's like a living brush pile, but that's all you get. So yeah, so if you want a grassy meadow, you're going to have to keep it in grass and forbs through active management. I don't think, could you burn it? If you could, that'd be cool. That would help. That'd be like really good mowing. That's a great question. I like that one. And oh, and by the way, meadows are wonderful diversity. You know, it's not part of managing small lands for wildlife is not to have everything in forest. It's great to have, you know, a little meadow, or wetlands are wonderful, creek, on and on. Yep. Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Chrissy sent over this photo and can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. Was wondering what these scratch marks are. There were no paw prints nearby.
Okay, this was just recently. That's pretty recent. Okay, what are we looking at? A cherry?
Is Chrissy on this call? I thought I saw her.
Was it in the fall? Or this is recently, Christy? Okay, all right. So look, it's low. So I like to do this when you're doing forensics on tree damage. It's not a bear, it's too low. It's not a porcupine because it's not chewed. It's not a rabbit, it would be lower and they wouldn't chew a tree that big. And where's this at? Let's do some more forensics here.
Chris, I think you're on the call, right? Chris Gildow?
You can turn the mute off, that's okay. Where are we at here? I'm saying that to give you choices of your candidates, because it's probably not a cougar and it's probably not a bear, because bears don't do it like that. It could, okay, I'm thinking it's a bobcat. I'm thinking a bobcat scratch. Is it on both sides of the tree? Because it looks like claw marks rather than teeth marks. And so like a cat going.
Huh. Kirk, do you remember where the Gildau's forest is?
Oh, Gilda. Yeah, they're actually in Olympia. And it's
No, I don't think mountain beaver, Andrew, because it's too high. Mountain beaver don't, they generally don't, they don't chew on bigger things. They don't climb, and they wouldn't do that scratch thing. Here I am pointing at the screen as if you could see my finger like that. That's like a scratch. This looks almost like a chew, but
Hi, we finally found the speaker. It's Chris.
there you are. Hi, Chris.
Hi. The land is in Stanwood, Washington,
Okay.
and Chris is my husband's here. We're both Chris.
Yeah, so I noticed the scratches last week. The highest point that of the scratch is about 4 feet up from the ground, and it
Okay.
looks like on a small alder.
Okay.
And then it has that shredding down at the lower part.
Yeah, that's it. It does look like scratch. I'm imagining a bobcat reaching up and like being like a cat. Because it's not chewed. Okay, the reason I ask about the time of the year, it's not antlers. It's not an antler rub because it's spring. They're not doing that yet, and it's as fresh.
Mhm.
And it's
That's
and
in
it's
the-
yeah. Hey, oh, Chris, put your camera over it. Put your camera right on that tree.
Okay,
Your trail camera. I had one time where the guys had this like cedar tree with all this shredded, like those little tiny fine cedar shreds. And he was like, what is that? And I was a little mystified, but I'm thinking, well, maybe a squirrel. I don't know. And he put his trail camera on it and he got a Douglas squirrel, like pulling those little cedar shreds out. And then when you would check nest boxes, they were full of those little cedar shreds. And it was like, bam, there we were. So do your camera. I like that one.
thanks.
It's not it's not a deer and it's not a chew.
Hmm.
Good one.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay.
All right. I'm going to go to one of the ones that's in the chat here. Bob asked, have a question about how practical it is to try to actively plant understory species versus just letting nature fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
We are cleaning up after a thinning project last year and are thinking about doing some plantings this fall.
I personally am a big fan of adding species diversity where it doesn't exist. So it's kind of like, this is where kind of Kirk's question there about how do you assess a stand for habitat quality. I mean, that might be a place where you literally look at your shrub species composition where you are, and then look nearby. And the list of the best, in quote, best habitat shrubs are often things that have berries, you know, serviceberry, huckleberry. I love red elderberry. On the west side, red elder is just great browse, etc. But quite a few of these shrub plants need either a little bit of sun or a lot of time to get well developed. I know a lot of people don't like salmonberry, but salmonberry is a lovely understory plant. So if you can, and you have some opportunity, go for it, depending how much diversity you have, because nature taking its course, if you had an established forest and you did a thinning, you're going to get more of what's already there. The root mass is still intact. One kind of cool thing with selective forestry is your understory, you know, gets run over and stomped around a little bit, but I'm sure Alexandra and Kirk will verify this, and I know Kit can in spades. Pretty much the same stuff comes back. You squished it down, pow, here it comes. You give it a couple years. Is that fair, Kirk? And so if you're going to try to change the species composition by adding something, do it conscientiously and invest the effort into the plants that you put out there, which might include putting a bloody cage on them if you're afraid the deer are going to find them and eat them, but they might not. So my answer is it depends on what you have. And if it's mono, I guess, would it be monoculture if it was natural? I'm thinking of like a pure salmonberry stand that you wanted to add some red elder to. And you might say, okay, I'm going to do red elderberry right here, which might mean chopping back the salmonberry and, you know, doing the same competitive management you would to try to grow overstory trees. So yeah, if you need to do it, go for it. Use the conservation districts, dig stuff up from your neighbor's place or on your own property, move it around. So almost like an assessment of what you have to see if there's something you can do actively to add to the diversity on the site. Is that fair? I like that one. That's a very good question too, by the way. And we need to develop some hands-on guidelines for that. Yeah, that's a good one.
Thank you. That's in line with what we were thinking.
Is it? Sweet.
Yeah, so 10 years ago we had our first thinning and it was grossly overstocked, basically no understory. This year, 10 years
Where's
later,
the volume on this? Okay.
10 years later, what was that, Bob?
and so 10 years later we did another thinning and the spacing just looks wonderful. Things are coming back, but there's not a lot of, well, I'd like to see more huckleberries, salal, Oregon grape,
Oh,
some of those
yeah.
species in
You know,
there,
that's an interesting was it a plantation?
it was intended to be a plantation, but
Okay.
it's so there's large blocks of even age Doug fir mixed with
Yeah.
varied age white fir and big leaf maple and alder and
Cool.
wetlands, and it's not the poster child of an even age, but it has that character.
Yeah, because you know, a lot of times when they went into full-on even age management, they would hit the sites with herbicides sometimes, like once or even twice, and then that root mass that I'm assuming is there isn't there. And there are quite a few of these plantation stands where they get into closed canopy, they're 25 years old, and the understory is really, really diminished. And it's not automatic that would come back. And I guess you were piquing my thinking there that you could actively influence that. So I want to see how that comes out. That's good. Okay.
Great, thank you.
No, thank you.
With the 10 minutes we have left, I think I just want to open it up for people to ask questions themselves. So it's not just us talking. Feel free to just speak up or raise your Zoom hand.
Yeah, other questions you have, or unique wildlife sightings at your and in your forest, anything you care to share or wildlife related?
You know, I'm reading Cami K is making a really good comment here about meadow management and different elements to that. And Cami's adding to that discussion about how to manage meadows. So just give that a read. That's great. Yeah, this has been so interesting because I don't have all the answers, but in like conversation with Bob there, I keep getting, I love visiting people who are trying to address objectives, and there's many different ways. I think Rhonda's got a question, Alexandra.
Yeah, I was just wondering if, Ken, you could just mention some of the tips to placement of a bat box.
Oh, good one. Bat Conservation International, Bats Northwest, two good websites. From everything I'm learning about bat boxes, let's make this statement first. People are usually disappointed with bat boxes for multiple reasons. One of which is, how do you know if a bat's using it? You got to get a really bright light, shine it in there in the middle of the day. When do bats go into boxes? They go in during the day to roost, and they don't winter there. They winter in hollow trees, caves, something like that. So they're using the box. And I just learned this not long ago from a bat box aficionado, that they switch boxes. And so if you want to really go for it on bat boxes, put up a bunch of different shapes in warm places. So I'm going to get to answering your question. You want them exposed to the sun. Those rocket box things out in the open, if you have like a little meadow or a pond or something. So facing the warm, you paint them dark. The crack needs to be pretty narrow. Look on those websites for the specs, because sometimes people do homemade ones and they're too wide. They're actually too wide. Bats really, really like to just squish in there. So warm places in the open, interestingly, not on the side of a tree back in the forest. I don't think that roost sites in really older forests are necessarily limiting because there's something with loose bark, even the surface of a tree. I mean, the story you hear about bats a lot of times is I put up a box and I never saw it used, or I put up a box, but they keep going under the roof of my shed. I know you've heard that one all the time. Well, the reason is the like metal roofs with that little teeny crack. Holy smokes, that's perfect. Why would they go into a little box over there? So it's different than a nest box because a bat is looking for a roost. A nest box becomes the cavity itself, which is a focal point for reproduction. So out in the open, put up several, do several. And the way to monitor is to look with a really bright light and or put something, just put a board on the ground right under it so you can see bat poop. Guano.
See, the other thing I'd love to hear from folks is, what are you doing to enhance wildlife habitat? Is anybody actively engaged in any specific activity on their land?
Besides good forestry. Nice. Who cuts firewood? Here's one is, I know Kirk does this. If you gather firewood, get it from your thinnings and the little diameter stuff, the smaller diameter wood or blow down, candidly, even though that's good for the soil, that's where you're going to get a lot of your wood. But resist the temptation to take that large diameter snag, unless of course it's going to fall on your house.
It's a great point. Ken, you probably see this all the time also. I come across forest owners that are consistently cutting down all of the dead trees in their forest because, that's what they've done for generations. They cleaning up the forest, get rid of that pesky dead wood. So just changing that habit alone, leaving, as long as it's safe, leaving that dead wood standing.
Well said. Yeah, the forests are not tidy. I have to confess that when I meet someone who says, "Well, we need to get out and clean up the woods," this is language. It's like, well, forests aren't tidy in general. So yeah, good point, Kirk.
Well, I'll share one thing that I did recently in my family's forest, and I think I talked about this a couple fireside chats ago, and we discussed the EQIP and CSP funding programs through the NRCS. We pre-commercially thinned kind of a mixed Douglas fir alder stand. And given that these were, a young forest, third generation, there was no large down logs in there. So we took a lot of the small diameter poles and stacked them up, in parallel to create constructed down logs, and did this with the kids. It was a great activity with them. I was cutting the trees, bucking them, and my son and daughter were moving these poles, and we stacked them so it made about a 20-inch wide, 20-inch tall, 20-foot long, quote unquote constructed log, and then we threw some of the fine branches on top of that.
Nice.
That's
a bioden. That's a habitat pile.
Here we go. That was the idea.
So here's one we missed a little bit ago. Scott asked, are the slash piles left by the previous owner acting similar to a down log? Don't they act similar to a habitat pile? Yes, Scott, and you could do like what Kirk was just talking about. You could rearrange some of that material to make it a little bit more effective. But yes, they do. They do function as that downwood stuff. I've seen a lot of really old slash piles back in the forest that are like, look at that. There it is. Yep. Let's see. There was one other about meadows, but I think we kind of covered that. Okay, sorry about that. I was just looking back through there to see if we forgot
Well,
something.
good, folks. Yeah, if you have any questions, we're happy to hang in for another 5-10 minutes or so. Questions for Ken or personal anecdotes for what you're doing in your own woodlands?
Oh, we got one about bat poop here. That bat poop is powdery when you squish it. Now, this is true. And mouse poop, which is like more fibrous. Yeah. And they look different. They have like really little skinny ends on them. Whereas mouse poop, we all know what mouse poop looks like. Yeah, there's lots of cool things about wildlife. And if you suspect that your activity would benefit some particular species, you're probably right. You know, and if you're thinking about like the size of a hiding place for a rabbit, and you built your habitat pile thinking about a cottontail rabbit, you're probably right. Yep, it'll work. You build it, they will come. Something will come. And then, of course, you get something you didn't want. And then we have a nuisance wildlife problem, which is a whole nother topic. Yeah. Well, Kirk, go ahead.
One last question. Someone in the registration asked about your recommendation for best wildlife cameras.
You know, they're all pretty good now. Gosh, there's a bunch of different kinds. You don't need the ones that go to your phone. You know, they have these what do you call it? Just get the simplest one you can with the fewest features, because then you won't get confused. If you get the ones that have too many settings, I like the ones that say on setting, and the setting goes video or camera. Okay, I'll have that. And then get 2 cards, those little cards. And then when you'll go run the trap line after a while and take them out. This was a great tip that I got from a landowner. He would go to secondhand stores and buy tripods, like old camera tripods, and all in a rare case of useful standardization, which is probably similar to USB ports, the threads on cameras all match. And so the threads on a trail camera will go right on the tripod. And then on your property, you just and then you're able to sit the tripod like in the middle of the trail, pointing up or down. You don't want to put the camera across the trail or across the road. You know, you want to put it up and down so that something coming towards you or going away from you will go through it. So, you know, they're all pretty good. You can get 3-packs sometimes, but do switch the cards out. And I think the simpler the better, as is the case with a lot of electronic stuff. They've gotten way, way better in the last few years. Yeah, Kirk's nodding there too. So that's been my experience and my observation with people. Christmas is coming. Yeah. And there's a data set of people who have, of pictures from remote trail cameras on private lands of all kinds of wildlife that people just normally don't see. Cougars, bobcats as 2 examples, you know, where all of a sudden we'll get these stories like, oh, there's cougars around here. How did you know? My neighbor got one on the trail camera. It's like, oh, so anyway, yeah, good question though, trail cams. We did an article in Forest Stewardship Notes about trail cams. So if you're familiar with Forest Stewardship Notes, look that one back up, and it did a little bit of the homework on those questions. That's a good one.
So you can't figure it out.
If you haven't ever taken coach planning, sign up for the WSU class. There you go. Look at you, Alex. You rock there, buddy. Trail Cam's Greatest Hits, Volume 1. Volume 2 is coming up. Send me your best ones. You're gonna want to be in on that. There's prizes. Well, no, there's not, but that's okay.
I'll put in one last plug for just a simple habitat enhancement technique. I know a lot of small woodland owners have very young forests out there, and you mentioned earlier in your presentation that it's the large snags that provide, you know, the broadest range of habitat benefits, you know, for those of us that don't have those big trees quite yet. You know, I'm always amazed at how wildlife still utilize even small trees. You know, I'll find 8-inch diameter, 6-inch, 10-inch diameter trees that are just riddled with the holes where obviously, you know, woodpeckers or something are going after the bugs inside of there. So on my own land with the trees that don't have good timber quality, you know, they've got some sweep to them or a broken top at 24 feet or something like that. You know, I've begun girdling those trees to turn them into snags, and you know, with the hope, expectation that once they start rotting and the bugs get in there, that the wildlife, you know, will come and find them. So even if you don't have 20-inch diameter trees, you know, still either hang on to the small diameter dead trees you have, some of them anyway, you know, or consider girdling or otherwise killing those smaller trees. as an alternative to just, cutting them to get them out of the way.
Yeah. The girdling technique, and I'm nodding and I've never seen long-term monitoring as to whether or not they rot out where you girdled them. I don't think so. My suspicion is it's going to dry. You're going to break the cambium, the tree's going to die, and then it's not going to necessarily break where the girdle is. But
I'm very curious myself. I've always heard that criticism that it creates a point of rot down there, and so you've got a short-lived snag. So,
right.
Well, I've got 40 of them now. So,
but that's an assumption. You know what? That's an assumption. We don't really know. Maybe, hey, Kirk, maybe there's your monitoring project, and by the time you're 65 years old, you'll have an answer.
I'll let you know at that point.
Okay, cool.
All right, folks. Well, out of respect for Ken in the evening and my own family, for that matter, I think we'll sign off. Ken, thank you so much for joining us. And like we've done with all of these fireside chats, within a few days, Alex will have posted this to the Northwest Natural Resource Group's YouTube channel. And so if you want to go back and relive all of Ken's greatest hits, you can watch it there or forward this on to somebody else.
Hey, you didn't play the bear song.
Oh,
dude.
you know what? If people want to stick around for 2.5 more minutes, actually, you're welcome to go if you want. But we've got a treat for you here. Thanks for reminding me, Ken. Alex, do you have that queued up? We're going to send you off with some warm and fuzzies here. So thanks for joining us, folks. And for one last adieu, once more into the breach, here's Ken and his alter ego.
This is a backstory. It was at Dave News Tree Farm. And during COVID, we had to do a virtual field day. And so I wrote this song and Dave goes, hey, play your song. So I did. And then he made this video with bears from his property. So here we go.
Can you see it?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hopefully we can hear it. There we go. Oh. Oh. It's slow. Oh. Are you guys seeing? Oh, here we go. Can't hear it.
You can't hear it?
No.
It's often the trouble with Zoom. It doesn't play video well at times.
Okay. I will
send
out
the
link to it.
Yeah, check it out. This was fun, and Dave knew it was his videography debut, and it was a song I wrote about bears.
And make sure you like it so Ken gets over the 1,000 likes and gets 15 cents for the from YouTube.
No, Kirk, it's public domain. We did it for WSU. Yeah, it's public domain. So no, it's pretty cool. Well, hey, thanks everybody. There's my email if you got something you want to hit me with. I appreciate the great work that NNRG does. You guys just rock. And we try to help and they try to help. And we just love our forest landowners. And Kit, nice to see you, and Holly and others that I haven't met yet. So awesome. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night and hope to see you all next month. We don't know what the topic's going to be, but we'll let you know a few days in advance. So take care and good night.
Thanks for having me.